Welcome back, sweet dreamer. Tonight on Sleepy Crown, we continue our tranquil journey through the great philosophers in Part 3, beginning with the revolutionary partnership of Friedrich Engels, the wealthy industrialist who championed the working class, and gently arriving at the provocative era of Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, who dared to challenge everything we thought we knew about morality and existence. Before you let sleep take you away, please like this peaceful tale, share a comment about which philosopher's ideas intrigue you most, and subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers. Get comfy under your blanket, let your thoughts slow, and allow the soft echo of 19th century intellectual revolution to carry you gently towards sleep. If you enjoy these calming tales, we're always happy to have you here in our cozy circle of history lovers. Friedrich, later known as Friedrich Engels, entered this world on the 28th of November 1820 in the bustling town of Barmen, nestled along the banks of the River Wupper in what was then part of the Kingdom of Prussia's western territories. This town would later merge into the modern city of Wuppertal, but in Engels' time, it stood as a thriving center of textile production in the German Rhineland. The Engels family had built their prosperity through generations of textile enterprise. Friedrich's father, who shared his son's name, descended from Johann Caspar Engels, a visionary entrepreneur who had established a flourishing linen bleaching operation under the family banner of Caspar Engels und Sohn. Born in 1796, the elder, Friedrich had dedicated his life to expanding the family's commercial empire. When his own father, Johann Caspar Engels II, passed away in 1821, Friedrich Sr. found himself embroiled in lengthy inheritance disputes with his siblings that would drag on until 1837. Eventually, he formed a partnership with the Dutch Erman brothers, establishing cotton manufacturing facilities across Manchester, Barmen, and the nearby town of Engelskirchen. While Friedrich Sr. possessed a reputation for calculating business practices and strict religious devotion, he also harbored artistic sensibilities, playing multiple musical instruments and organizing family musical evenings. In 1819, he married Elizabeth von Haar, affectionately called Elise by the family circle. She brought intellectual heritage from her family lineage in nearby Ham, where clerics and scholars had shaped her upbringing. Together, they would welcome 8 children into their household, 4 sons and 4 daughters, with young Friedrich claiming the position of eldest. Among his siblings, Elizabeth's scholarly background profoundly influenced her firstborn son, nurturing his developing fascination with literature and the mythological tales of classical antiquity. Though Friedrich would eventually sever ties with his namesake father over political disagreements, his bond with his mother remained unbroken throughout her lifetime. Friedrich Engels emerged into a world experiencing dramatic, political and industrial transformation across the European continent. The French Revolution of 1789 had unleashed radical liberal concepts of universal human rights throughout France, though these ideals soon descended into the bloodshed and terror of the early 1790s. Napoleon Bonaparte's subsequent rise to power in 1799, first as consul and later as emperor, restored French stability, while his continental conquests ultimately ended in defeat. By 1815, among the crucial factors contributing to Napoleon's downfall was Britain's economic supremacy, achieved through the Royal Navy's dominance of global maritime commerce and the nation's pioneering industrial revolution during the latter half of the 18th century. France's defeat and Britain's mounting prosperity highlighted industrialization's tremendous advantages, spurring continental European powers to emulate the British model. The Engels family stood among the industrial pioneers, transforming the Rhineland into Germany's manufacturing powerhouse throughout the 19th century. In 1775, Friedrich's great-grandfather had introduced mechanical lace-making techniques to the region. During young Friedrich's birth, Barmen housed roughly 16,000 residents, a figure that would double to 40,000 within 2 decades as the town earned recognition as the German Manchester. However, this rapid industrialization brought troubling social consequences, particularly the emergence of an urban working class, trapped in poverty and subjected to harsh working conditions, sometimes laboring 60 to 70 hours weekly. The Engels factory distinguished itself as one of the few regional enterprises refusing to employ child labor, while the family pursued philanthropic initiatives, supporting less fortunate community members. Little documentation survives regarding Friedrich Jr.'s early childhood experiences, though he and his siblings spent most of their time with their mother, as Friedrich Sr. remained preoccupied managing his expanding business interests. In 1828, Friedrich began attending Barman's local elementary school. Although he later criticized his teachers for conservative and unimaginative approaches, he found genuine enjoyment in chemistry and physics lessons, sparking a lifelong fascination with scientific inquiry. At 14, Friedrich was sent to board at the prestigious gymnasium in Elberfeld under the supervision of headmaster Dr. Hanschke. Engels later acknowledged this institution as among Prussia's finest educational establishments, where he received comprehensive liberal education encompassing various sciences, multiple ancient and modern languages, plus historical and religious studies. Friedrich excelled particularly in linguistic studies and encountered the influential philosophers of the 18th century Enlightenment, who championed human reason over religious superstition. Engels also developed deep interest in German folklore and historical narratives, which inspired the romantic patriotism advocated by Johann Gottlieb von Herder and Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Although the conservative Prussian monarchy had acquired the Rhineland following the Napoleonic Wars, liberal German patriotic movements continued wielding influence until 1819, when Prince Clemens von Metternich, the powerful Austrian chancellor, implemented the Karlsbad decrees to suppress liberal student organizations and restrict press freedoms. These Austrian measures quickly spread throughout the German Confederation territories, including Prussia. At Elberfeld, teenage Engels composed poetry and essays celebrating liberal traditions. These perspectives conflicted sharply with his father's views, leading to Friedrich's withdrawal from the gymnasium against his wishes in 1837. Instead of pursuing his intellectual passions, Friedrich was introduced to textile business operations. In 1838, father and son traveled to England to inspect Ehrman and Engels' Manchester operations. During their return journey, they stopped at the historic port city of Bremen, where young Friedrich was apprenticed to linen merchant Heinrich Leupold. Working as a trading house clerk, Engels managed international transactions and developed understanding of global capitalism through exchange rates, import duties, and profit margins. While in Bremen, Engels encountered the radical politics of Junges Deutschland, or Young Germany, a left-wing nationalist organization rejecting romantic nostalgia for medieval Germany in favor of progressive democratic ideals, characterized by religious freedom and aristocratic privilege abolition. In 1839, Engels published his first work, a poem titled The Bedouin, lamenting how this once proud Arab people had been reduced to performing in Parisian circuses. Beyond these poetic endeavors, Engels contributed essays to Telegraph for Deutschland under the pseudonym Friedrich Oswald, avoiding association of the respectable Engels family name with his increasingly radical political positions. These pieces were interspersed among literary criticism and travel accounts to evade censorship. During the 1830s, as Barman's textile industry suffered from competition not only from England, but also emerging producers in Belgium, France, Austria, and other regions, profits declined while working conditions deteriorated. In 1839, Engels published Letters from Wuppertal, highlighting the demoralized, exploited, and often excessively intoxicated condition of the working population, as many people turned to increasing alcohol consumption to numb the physical aches and psychological pain of prolonged factory and mine labor. In his attack on Wuppertal's employers, Engels exposed the hypocrisy of men who eagerly broadcast their supposed religious devotion to the wider community while simultaneously becoming the worst exploiters of those communities' poorer sections. Such sentiments reflected Engels' own rejection of the dogmatic Protestantism inherited from his father. After encountering David Friedrich Strauss's Life of Jesus, which approached the Bible as a historical document rather than divine revelation, Engels definitively abandoned Christian faith. Instead, Engels soon embraced the philosophy of Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel, a German philosopher who had recently died in 1831 and whose work was still being published posthumously throughout the 1830s and 1840s. Hegel perceived historical progress driven by the spirit or self-conscious human reason. While Hegel didn't entirely reject divine concepts, he envisioned God and humanity sharing a common path toward freedom and progress, rejecting humanity's subservience to divinity. In 1841, as part of his mandatory military service requirement in the Prussian Guards artillery, Engels relocated to Berlin. Besides donning a Prussian artilleryman's uniform and participating in military drills, Engels spent leisure time attending lectures at the city's university, known today as Humboldt University. Hegel had served as philosophy chair there from 1818 until his death in 1831. While Hegel's emphasis on state authority as a primary driver of historical development was embraced by Prussian conservatives, Hegel's more radical disciples utilized the Hegelian dialectic, the concept of employing opposing thesis and antithesis in argumentation before reaching synthesis to explain historical progression. According to this framework, each historical era was defined by prevailing social and political orthodoxy, which was then challenged, ultimately resulting in political synthesis. For instance, the French Revolution had begun with the Ancien regime's orthodoxy and monarchical absolutism. This was subsequently challenged by radical liberalism through the 1789 revolution before a synthesis emerged in the early 19th century, specifically a French monarchy incorporating democratic elements while abandoning 17th and 18th century absolutism. Young Hegelians drew inspiration from this approach to political development, offering liberal challenges to Prussian conservatism. Engels spent many evenings discussing philosophical questions in Berlin, taverns with like-minded academics and journalists who gathered around philosopher Bruno Bauer, a former Hegel student. In October 1842, Engels completed his national service year and returned to Barmen. Dismayed by his son's increasing radicalism, Friedrich Engels Sr. resolved to send him to Manchester as general assistant at the Ehrman and Engels mill there. En route to England in November 1842, Engels visited the Rheinische Zeitung newspaper offices in Cologne, where he first met editor Karl Marx, born in Trier in western Germany in 1818 to a Jewish family that had recently converted to Lutheranism. Marx initially studied law at the University of Bonn before transferring to philosophy at the University of Berlin, where he joined the young Hegelian movement. Since his anti-religious thesis proved too controversial for conservative Berlin, Marx left the Prussian capital in 1841, several months before Engels' arrival, and received his doctorate from the University of Jena. In 1842, he began writing for the newly established Rheinische Zeitung, and immediately revived the struggling paper's fortunes after becoming its editor. Engels had already contributed to the Rheinische Zeitung. The pair's political, philosophical, and social views would gradually align over the subsequent years, notably as both Marx and Engels grew to disagree with certain Hegelian thought orthodoxies. Within a few years, they would also form one of the 19th century's most significant intellectual partnerships. When Engels arrived in December 1842, Manchester was a city exceeding 300,000 residents at the heart of Britain's textile industry. French political scientist Alexis de Tocqueville, fresh from publishing his landmark 2-volume study, Democracy in America, had described Manchester as a new Hades. shrouded in black smoke emanating from countless chimneys, where one cannot escape the crunching wheel of machinery or the noise of the furnaces. Although he had made several brief visits to the city previously, Engels was shocked by the poverty and destitution levels he encountered. A few months earlier, Manchester had experienced the plug plot riots as strikes erupted across the country. In August 1842, after London's political authorities rejected working-class demands for universal male suffrage and labor reforms, Engels worked at the Victoria Mill in Salford across the River Irwell from Manchester. He attended meetings at the Owenite Hall of Science, an institution founded by followers of agrarian socialist Robert Owen, who inspired cooperative creation throughout the country. Engels also established relationships with the Chartist movement, a group advocating for universal male suffrage and annual elections. While Engels sympathized with working-class Chartism, he didn't believe reforms within existing social and political systems were sufficient for English working-class emancipation. In his critique of industrial capitalism, Engels was influenced by Thomas Carlyle's writings, who considered factory workers' lives worse than medieval serfs. Among Engels' guides to Manchester's working-class areas was Mary Burns, a young woman of Irish extraction in her early 20s. She may have been a domestic servant or factory worker when she met Engels in early 1843. The two soon became romantic partners and would live together for the next 20 years. Though both considered marriage an oppressive bourgeois institution, Mary introduced Engels to Manchester's Irish immigrant community, who lived in the city's most deprived areas that someone like Engels from an upper-class background would rarely have visited during the 19th century. Here, Mary provided Engels with invaluable insight into working-class conditions that influenced his thinking, having recognized that German socialist and communist thought had been overly theoretical. In 1843, Engels wrote an article entitled Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy for the Deutsche Französische Jahrbucher, Marx's new publication, in which he conducted empirical analysis of Britain's capitalist political economy, arguing that private property had led to humanity's alienation from its natural essence and transformed humans into slaves to material goods. For Engels, private property abolition would bring forth communism, an emerging political concept in the 1840s, favoring creation of a new utopian society in which industrial businesses would be taken over by collective or communal worker groups. In this way, the average worker would transition from being an oppressed individual whose labor was exploited by bourgeois capitalists to someone controlling his own destiny. Engels developed these ideas into a series of articles eventually collected into one of his most famous books, The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in German in 1845, citing not only his first-hand Manchester slum experiences, but also government records and liberal bourgeois newspaper articles. Engels declared, "I accuse the English bourgeois before the entire world of murder, robbery, and other crimes on a massive scale." While writing about England, he was also issuing a warning to the German bourgeoisie, believing that the social crisis he witnessed in England would soon spread to the continent. Despite having Mary Burns as his guide, Engels couldn't avoid stereotyping the Irish as carefree, cheerful, potato-eating children of nature, wholly unsuited to slaving away in Manchester's factories, whose only response to wretched existence was turning to drink. Engels observed that the dreadful conditions the Irish endured also served to drive down wages for other workers, leading to widespread poverty. Describing constant factory worker surveillance by managers and the practice of advancing clocks by 15 minutes, so workers would lose several hours of pay when arriving for work, Engels concluded that English working-class existence was worse than African slaves in North America. In subsequent sections of his work, Engels observed that the industrial city of Manchester had been purposely constructed to separate the urban proletariat of poor workers from the capitalist bourgeoisie, a radical departure from his native Barmen, where owners and workers lived in close proximity. While Manchester's city centre housed attractive shops and warehouses and served as a location for business transactions, it was surrounded by high-density working-class districts, crisscrossed by a maze of alleyways. More affluent inhabitants lived further out in neighborhoods ordered by regular street patterns, while the wealthiest lived in countryside villas free from dirty air. Most ingeniously, wealthier districts were connected to the center via straight roads, lined with respectable shops, so they could travel to commercial districts without witnessing working-class slum penury. Yet Engels believed that careful urban zoning carried out by the bourgeoisie to separate themselves from working classes also created conditions for workers to coalesce and develop class consciousness. This offered the possibility of a class-conscious proletariat soon rising in response to these poor conditions. Engels saw the clash between proletariat and bourgeoisie as the next stage of historical development, leading to big industrial cities' destruction in favor of town and country fusion. The condition of the working class in England was largely written and compiled in Germany. As Engels left Manchester and returned to Barmen in summer 1844, on his return journey, he met with Karl Marx in Paris on August 28th. Since their previous meeting, Marx had moved to Paris after the Rheinische Zeitung was closed by Prussian authorities following a complaint by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia about the paper's commentary on Polish nationalism, Poland then being largely subsumed within the Kingdom of Prussia and the Russian Empire. Marx was impressed by Engels' writings on capitalist economy, and the two men became close ideological allies. As a result of this second meeting, they would become lifelong friends and collaborators, launching a famous partnership lasting the next 4 decades. The two men had taken independent paths to arrive at the same ideological destination, and during their long collaboration, Engels was content to allow Marx to lead in establishing their philosophy's ideological basis, though he played an important role in structuring Marx's thoughts. Their first collaboration was a brief attack on Bruno Bauer and the young Hegelians under the satirical title The Holy Family, which denounced their obsession with metaphysical Hegelian spirit without acknowledging material wealth and property's role in determining social structures. On his journey from Paris to Barmen, Engels was excited to see socialist and communist sentiments spreading in the Rhineland. In early 1845, he and Jewish German philosopher and social commentator Moses Hess organized a series of meetings about communism among local bourgeoisie. Engels built on themes he had first outlined in Outlines of the Critique of Political Economy, arguing that capitalist competition would eventually lead to a society composed of a small number of immensely wealthy individuals and a mass of destitute workers, with nobody in between, building pressure for more equitable wealth distribution. Engels argued that a communist system would be more productive, eliminating resource waste expended in competing for the same objective in favor of efficient resource allocation where required, while technological innovation could be harnessed for public good. Engels reassured his conservative audience that communism would be brought about not by violent revolution, but by paternalistic persuasion. Engels won over a handful of converts during each meeting, but his activities brought him to authorities' attention, causing great embarrassment to his father, who cut him off from his allowance. This fraught relationship between Friedrich and the rest of his family would prevail for virtually his entire adult life. Meanwhile, Marx had been forced to leave Paris for Brussels after fresh complaints about his actions in the French capital. In spring 1845, Engels joined him in the Belgian capital. The two friends made a brief trip to England to visit the city's slums and study economic data at Manchester's Chatham Library. Engels re-established contact with Mary Burns, who joined them when they returned to Belgium in late summer. In Brussels, Marx and Engels lived with their respective partners in neighboring apartments. The two men embarked on their next collaboration, entitled The German Ideology. Although never published in their lifetimes, the book was a key step in developing their theory of historical materialism. a doctrine holding that historical change was dictated by transformation from one mode of social organization to another, as determined by economic and technological factors, rather than nation-states and their rulers' actions, which was the more traditional view of historical causation at the time. Marx and Engels observed that each stage of social transformation was fiercely resisted by ruling elites, and that only revolution would bring about new forms of social organization. Such revolution didn't necessarily have to be violent. Marx and Engels believed democracy establishment through universal suffrage would eventually bring about communism in a relatively peaceful manner. In line with this view, in 1846, Marx and Engels formed the Communist Correspondence Committee to coordinate European socialist activities. From its inception, there was a dogmatic quality to it, with Marx and Engels attempting to impose ideological uniformity on committee members. In this spirit, Engels went to Paris in August 1846 to take on supporters of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the French philosopher whose 1840 treatise What is Property had influenced Marx and Engels' belief that the very concept of private property was causing many of industrial society's problems. Still, Proudhon's prescriptions of socialist cooperation were deemed too idealistic. In June 1847, Engels attended the League of the Just Congress in London as its representative from Paris, during which the organization changed its name to the Communist League and adopted the slogan, "Working Men of All Countries Unite." Engels was tasked with drafting a statement of the League's aims, which initially took the form of a catechism entitled Draft of a Communist Confession of Faith, in which he declared that communism's aim was to organize society in such a way that every member of it can develop and use all his capabilities and powers in complete freedom and without thereby infringing the basic conditions of this society. Although the text contained much of Marx and Engels' ideas about the proletariat as the vanguard of socialist revolution, Engels had been forced to compromise with utopian socialists, and in October produced a second draft, The Principles of Communism. The Principles had been produced in advance of a second conference in London beginning in late November. On this occasion, Marx was in attendance, and he and Engels ensured that the principles were adopted unanimously. The two men were then asked to write a manifesto based on these principles, first in London and later in Brussels. Marx and Engels worked on what would become the Communist Manifesto, one of the most influential works of political theory in history. The Communist Manifesto owed much to Engels' observations of the English proletariat in Manchester, which served as the basis for describing the global proletariat, described as a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. Marx and Engels cast aside their Hegelian baggage by declaring that the history of all hitherto existing class society is the history of class struggles, ultimately leading to proletarian revolution. Nevertheless, Marx's literary style came to the fore in his description of rapid industrial and social development brought about by the bourgeoisie, claiming that the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society, with the consequence that all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober sense his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. The text went on to articulate how communist society should be created. Although the Communist Manifesto text was the result of considerable intellectual exchange between Marx and Engels going back to 1843, the treatise was largely authored by Marx, not Engels, though both their names would appear on the cover when published in London, late in February 1848. Despite its later influence, the Communist Manifesto had virtually no impact among wider society when first published. Instead, Marx and Engels were overtaken by revolution on the streets of Paris and many other European capitals. On February 24, 1848, The increasingly autocratic King Louis-Philippe I was overthrown and the Second French Republic established in his place in France. The bourgeois democratic revolution, predicted by Marx and Engels, appeared to be underway, and the two men were keen to play their part. In order to evade attempts by European monarchies to arrest them as part of wider reactionary crackdowns on political dissidents, they left Brussels and arrived in Paris in early March. The events in Paris inspired demonstrations in Vienna, which led to Metternich's resignation in March, alongside nationalist uprisings in northern Italy against Austrian rule. By mid-March, revolution had reached Prussia, where King Friedrich William IV was compelled to make liberal concessions to keep hold of his throne. Marx and Engels decided to establish their base in Cologne, where Marx resurrected his old newspaper as the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, calling for a united front between workers and elements of the bourgeoisie. Engels was sent to Barmen to raise money from his relatives, but came back empty-handed. The honeymoon of the revolutions of 1848 didn't last long, and by summer, the forces of conservatism and reaction regained initiative, making some concessions to buy off the liberal bourgeoisie. Ruling classes in places like Germany and Austria isolated radicals and employed military force to re-establish their authority. By September 1848, Engels was on the run and returned to Paris, from where he embarked on a long journey to Bern in Switzerland. He took great interest in events in Hungary, where nationalist leader Lajos Kossuth had taken control of the Diet in Budapest and established a government independent of the Austrian Empire. Kossuth's Hungarian nationalism was opposed by Slavic minorities who allied with the Austrian army to defeat the Hungarians, while the Vienna government was also allied with the Russian Empire in crushing nationalist movements in Eastern and Central Europe. Inspired by Kossuth, Engels was determined to return to Germany to fight a guerrilla war against Prussian authorities and returned to Cologne in January 1849. In March, a National Assembly in Frankfurt adopted a liberal imperial constitution for a united Germany and invited King Friedrich William IV to be its emperor. The Prussian king's refusal to accept a crown from a popular assembly sparked further risings against Prussian authority, and in May 1849, the workers of Elberfeld formed a revolutionary militia. Engels was appointed to organize the town's defenses, but by replacing the German black-red-gold tricolor with the red flag of communism, he alarmed his compatriots and was soon ordered to leave. As Prussian armies cracked down on insurgents, Engels joined rebel leader August Willich in Baden, in southwestern Germany, where he took part in a battle that constituted a valiant but forlorn effort to prevent the last pockets of revolutionary resistance from being eliminated by the Prussian army. Engels retreated to Switzerland in the aftermath of the failed revolution. There he wrote an account of his experiences in the campaign for the German imperial constitution, attacking the petty bourgeoisie for abandoning the workers. The experience of 1848 prompted Marx and Engels to rethink their strategy. After shutting down the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, Marx had briefly moved to Paris, but the increasingly dictatorial French government under Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the future Emperor Napoleon III, forced him into exile in London. Engels soon joined him there, and the pair would base themselves out of Britain for decades to come. In the aftermath of 1848, Marx and Engels were caught up in recriminations over the revolution's failure in a country that harbored revolutionary exiles from all over the continent. True to form, the pair left old comrades behind as their ideology evolved, rather than a two-stage revolution in which they saw the proletariat working hand in hand with the petty bourgeoisie to achieve gradual social and political change. Engels and Marx now believed that the proletariat had to walk its own path in an effort to defeat the remnants of feudal order and the prevailing capitalist order to attain socialism and communism. In addition to their political struggles, neither Marx nor Engels had much money after relocating to England at the end of the 1840s. This situation forced a reluctant Engels to return to work for the family business in Manchester. The Manchester of the early 1850s had changed considerably from Engels' experience of the city a few years earlier. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 to reduce grain prices represented liberalism's triumph over both aristocratic conservatism and Chartism, and while there had been some unrest in Britain in 1848, it was muted by comparison with what occurred on the continent. These developments caused Engels to lament that England was now home to both a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois proletariat. During the 1850s, the British cotton industry experienced a boom thanks to new markets opening in the Americas, Australia, and China via steamships that had proliferated since the late 1830s. Ermine and Engels' cotton sewing thread was consequently in high demand. Among Engels' tasks was to audit the company's books to ensure that his father's business partners weren't undermining his interests by running side businesses. To his father's surprise, Engels conducted a thorough investigation into the company's finances, and a reconciliation of sorts between the pair occurred in 1851. Engels was subsequently granted a 7.5% share of the company's profits, which amounted to the equivalent of a six-figure salary in modern monetary terms. While Engels struggled with the uncomfortable reality that he was making money through what he perceived as exploitation of the proletariat, he consoled himself with the knowledge that he was supporting the revolutionary cause by financing Marx, often sending half his annual salary to Karl in London. Marx and Engels believed that a precondition of socialist revolution was an economic collapse that would create a vast pool of unemployed workers ready to lead revolution. From his managerial post, Engels had insight into global markets' health, but with every downturn, the English working class failed to stir. Marx and Engels had high hopes when the American Civil War badly damaged the British cotton industry in the early 1860s. This led to a decline in raw cotton from Virginia and the thawed Carolinas for British factories to spin into processed textiles. However, British textile workers stoically endured the economic downturn, and there was no major unrest in cities like Manchester as the Civil War raged across the Atlantic between 1861 and 1865. With all quiet on the revolutionary front, Engels encouraged Marx to continue working on his extensive analysis of capitalism that would eventually become his magnum opus, Das Kapital. Marx and Engels carried on an almost daily correspondence, and the former called on the latter to provide empirical data from Manchester's factories to support his theoretical arguments. Engels' greatest sacrifice for Marx possibly had nothing to do with money or revolutionary theory, but rather Marx's personal life. During these years, Engels unofficially acknowledged paternity of Henry Frederick Demuth, a boy Marx had possibly fathered with his housekeeper Hallang Demuth in 1851. During a period when Karl's wife was away from London, Marx's family was confused by Engels' dismissive attitude toward young Freddie. It was only after Engels' own death, many decades later, that some of them began to suspect that Demuth was actually Karl's son, though this remains an issue of some controversy, and many biographers of both Marx and Engels don't agree that Demuth was, in fact, a son of Marx. What is clear is that Engels was living a kind of double life as well in Manchester. As a factory manager, he sought to disguise his relationship with Mary Burns, his long-term partner, though they had never married, an unusual arrangement in 19th century Europe. While keeping an official residence to maintain respectability, Engels spent much of his time living in a home where Mary lived. From the late 1850s, Engels became a member of the prestigious Cheshire Hunt, riding alongside some of the country's most prominent aristocrats. Engels was also a leading representative of the German émigré community and a member of several exclusive private members' clubs. The stress of living his double life, combined with Marx's incessant demands for money and articles, resulted in a bout of glandular fever in 1857, and his health suffered further following his father's death in 1860, which led to an attempt by the Ehrman brothers to force him out of the company. Despite all of this, Engels found time to contribute to the revolutionary cause by further developing the theory of historical materialism, first set out in the German ideology. For Marx and Engels, history wasn't determined by great men, but by socioeconomic forces outside their control. In Marx's words, men make their history, but they do not make it just as they please. In 1850, Engels had written The Peasant War in Germany, an analysis of a peasant uprising in southern Germany in the mid-1520s, inspired by the Protestant Reformation. The radical uprising had eventually been defeated. Engels drew parallels between the experiences of German peasants of the Reformation era and the manner in which the revolutionaries of 1848 had been betrayed by the bourgeoisie. Then, in the late 1850s, with tensions growing between France, Austria, and Prussia over the prospect of Italian unification, Engels anonymously published Po and Rhine, an astute analysis of Prussia's position, which was so highly praised on the continent that it was believed to have been written by a Prussian general. Not everything was smooth sailing during these years, though. In 1863, Engels suffered a major blow in his personal life with the unexpected death of his partner, Mary Burns, in her early 40s. Engels was appalled when Marx responded to the news by complaining about his own problems and asking for money. But their friendship survived after Marx sent an apologetic letter. In the aftermath of Mary's death, Engels grew closer to her sister, Lizzie, and they would eventually, after many years together, marry in 1878. As a result of his connections with the Burns sisters, Engels took greater interest in Ireland during these years and planned to write a history of the island, which would explore its position as England's first colony and the revolutionary movement there over the centuries. The project was never realized, though, in 1867, after 17 years of work, Marx had completed the manuscript of Volume 1 of Das Kapital, rewriting and editing significant parts following feedback from Engels. This, not the Communist Manifesto, was Marx's foremost work, an enormous text when the 3 volumes were eventually finished, one that outlined Marx's entire philosophical and political system and his view of materialist development of human history. One of the key ideas in Das Kapital was Marx's theory of surplus value, in which he argued that every hour of production, over and above the amount necessary for a worker to make a living, was expropriated by the factory owner as profit. In more graphic terms, Marx argued emotively of factory owners that they mutilate the laborer into a fragment of man, degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine, destroy every remnant of charm in his work, and turn it into a hated toil. The irony, of course, was that it wouldn't have been possible for Marx to complete Das Kapital had it not been for the financial support which Engels had provided over the years, much of which ultimately derived from his holdings in and work for the Ehrman and Engels factory. Following the publication of Das Kapital in September 1867, Engels set about publicizing the book by reaching out to contacts in Europe and America. In 1869, Engels' contract with the Ehrman and Engels firm came to an end, and neither Engels nor Gottfried Ehrman was keen on continuing the partnership. Anxious to get away from it all, Engels settled for a severance payment of £12,000, enough to sustain him and Marx for many years to come. Nevertheless, the often contradictory nature of Engels' activities continued, and during the 1870s, he invested much of this severance payment in the stock market to bolster his fortune. At the age of 49, he felt newly liberated, and in the summer of 1870, he and Lizzie moved to London. Keen to re-enter the world of revolutionary politics, Engels was immediately elected to the International Workingmen's Association, also known as the First International, a communist and radical socialist organization that had been founded in 1864. Engels was elected corresponding secretary to most European revolutionary parties. While his linguistic skills also led him to supervise the translation of his and Marx's work into a host of European languages. Engels' home at 122 Regent's Park Road soon began to attract communists from all over Europe, speaking a variety of tongues. Marx lived 10 minutes away to the north at Maitland Park Road, and Engels would visit his friend daily to exchange their latest thoughts. During this time, Marx continued to work on additional volumes of Das Kapital, while Engels pursued his own writing projects. Engels' arrival in London coincided with monumental events in continental Europe. During the 1860s, Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had set out to unite Germany by force. In 1864, the Prussian army led a German coalition to conquer the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein from Denmark, and in 1866, Prussia defeated Austria. To consolidate its leading position in Germany, not feeling threatened by Prussian militarism, in 1870, Emperor Napoleon III of France declared war on Prussia, after being provoked into doing so by Bismarck over a dispute regarding the succession to the throne of Spain. Thanks to Marx's connections, Engels was able to secure a role as a correspondent for the Pall Mall Gazette during the short Franco-Prussian War that followed. Through the cousin of a friend who served with the Germans, Engels was provided with details of the movements of the Prussian army, and he predicted Napoleon's defeat and capture at the Battle of Sedan on September 2, 1870, earning the nickname the General from Marx, though Marx and Engels sympathized with the Prussian cause and welcomed both the unification of Germany and the fall of the Bonapartist regime. Bismarck's demands to annex France's eastern provinces of Alsace and Lorraine prolonged the war and led to a brutal siege of Paris. Soon after the Prussians left Paris, the Parisian workers took control of the city in March 1871 and declared the establishment of the Paris Commune, a short-lived revolutionary government that was brutally suppressed by the French Third Republic in May. It is often perceived as the first effort at establishing a communist government anywhere in Europe. Meanwhile, the Franco-Prussian War had led to the creation of a German empire under Prussian domination. Marx and Engels argued that the Paris Commune had failed due to a lack of revolutionary organization and discipline, a theme that Engels returned to in his quest to undermine Mikhail Bakunin, the Russian anarchist who espoused individual freedom and saw Marxism as a recipe for authoritarianism. Although Marx and Engels successfully managed to expel Bakunin from the First International in 1872, political infighting fatally undermined the organization, which disbanded in 1876 after losing its momentum in the years after the Hague Conference of 1872. Despite its demise, Engels continued to liaise with Wilhelm Liebknecht and August Bebel's Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany. The German socialists experienced a surge in popularity after Bismarck cracked down on left-wing party organizations in 1878 and won 12 seats in the Reichstag in the 1881 elections. From his headquarters in London, Engels wrote extensively about political developments in the new German Empire. He also took a close interest in the revolutionary movement in Russia, which was divided between the orthodox Marxism of Georgy Plekhanov and the populism of Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who saw Russian peasant communes as the model for revolutionary socialism. Although he briefly endorsed the peasant commune as the means to overthrow the hated Tsarist autocracy, Engels ultimately saw it as a conservative and reactionary institution. Few people believed at the time that communism could ultimately take root in a largely agricultural society like Russia, but had only experienced limited industrialization. Aside from the task of promoting ideological unity among global communists, Engels turned his attention to the physical sciences. In Manchester, Engels had witnessed significant scientific and technological breakthroughs, and he and Marx both admired Darwin's On the Origin of Species, linking the theory of evolution and the struggle for survival to the class struggle. In Human Society, as he and Marx had done with history, Engels sought to apply Hegelian dialectics to the natural sciences. Between 1872 and 1883, he worked on a series of essays which were eventually compiled into Dialectics of Nature and published in 1927 following a recommendation from Albert Einstein. In his essay, The Part Played by Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man, Engels theorized that the development of opposable thumbs, resulting in the ability to make tools, enabled human beings to gain mastery over nature, and that the demands of labor led to the formation of human societies and systems of mutual support, which in turn produced human speech and supported the development of the human brain. According to Engels, labor represented the basic condition of human existence and separated humans from animals. While this theory of human brain development has subsequently been widely accepted by evolutionary biologists, Engels' scientific framework of dialectical materialism unwittingly turned science into an ideological battleground for 20th century communist regimes, leading to the rejection and persecution of scientists who adopted alternative scientific approaches. During the 1870s and 1880s, Engels also began to produce a series of pamphlets aimed at providing a concise introduction to Marx's thought for those without the time or inclination to read the cumbersome first volume of Das Kapital. The most influential of these was Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, published in French in 1880. Engels distinguished between Marx's scientific socialism as the natural successor to capitalism and the utopian socialism of other German thinkers of the time, the latter of which were deemed unrealistic in their idealism. According to Engels, once capitalism had collapsed as a result of its internal contradictions, the proletariat would seize political power and abolish all class distinctions. Under communism, the state would become superfluous and wither away, leading to the ultimate liberation of mankind. Beyond this, Engels enjoyed a semi-retirement from the mid-1870s onwards, relieved of his responsibilities as a company manager and of helping to run the now-defunct First International. He enjoyed spending time by the seaside with Lizzie and the Marx family. The sea air benefited the asthmatic Lizzie's fragile health, but she was also suffering from bladder cancer. Unlike her late sister Mary, Lizzie had retained her Catholic faith and wished to sanctify her relationship with Engels before her demise. On September 11, 1878, Engels summoned a nearby Anglican priest to conduct a marriage ceremony at Lizzie's bedside several hours before her death. Karl and Jenny Marx were also in increasingly poor health, and Karl was too ill to attend to Jenny. When she died in November 1881, Marx lingered on for more than a year. Engels continued to visit his friend daily. He had just arrived at Marx's house on the afternoon of March 14, 1883, when he died at the age of 64. Engels was one of only 11 mourners in attendance when Marx was buried alongside Jenny in Highgate Cemetery. In his eulogy, Engels declared that he was mourned by millions of revolutionary fellow workers, from the mines of Siberia to California. Engels dedicated the remainder of his life to protecting and promoting Marx's work. As Marx's literary executor, Engels not only had to sift his way through Marx's drafts, but was caught in a power struggle between Marx's surviving daughters, Laura and Eleanor. In addition to supervising the translation of Marx's published works, Engels faced a monumental task in preparing the unfinished drafts of the second and third volumes of Das Kapital for publication. He was disappointed to find that Marx had been distracted from developing his arguments by collecting reams of data on the American and Russian economies. 2 years after Marx's death, Volume 2 of Das Kapital was published in German in May 1885. The third volume proved a tougher challenge, and in the interests of clarifying the line of argument, Engels allowed himself extensive editorial freedom to restructure Marx's text and introduce his own material. Thus, it was not until 1894 that Volume 3 saw the light of day, and it bore Engels' imprint more than the first 2 volumes. Among Marx's papers, Engels found a summary of a study by the American anthropologist Lewis Morgan into the transformation from tribal societies to modern civilization, which focused on the Iroquois tribal confederacy and described the change from a system of social organization of shared property and sexual partners to one of a monogamous family unit. Engels was keen to apply historical materialism to Morgan's work, and in 1884 he produced The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, in light of the researches by Lewis H. Morgan. In August 1888, at the age of 68, Engels made a visit to North America. He had high hopes for the American labor movement, which was organizing a series of strikes in response to an era of capitalist excess known as the Gilded Age. Rather than address large crowds of striking workers, Engels preferred to travel incognito from New York to Boston before returning via Canada. Although the blinding electric lighting and ubiquitous advertising in New York City gave Engels a glimpse of the future of capitalism, the trip had a revitalizing impact. Back in England, Engels sensed that the docile British working classes were at last stirring, and he joined 200,000 socialists in the inaugural May Day parade through the streets of London on May 4, 1890. However, the socialist revival of the 1890s was led by bourgeois intellectuals such as the designer William Morris and the writer George Bernard Shaw, neither of whom had much interest or understanding of communist ideas. In a demonstration of loyalty to the Marx family, Engels supported Edward Aveling, Eleanor Marx's bigamous husband, whose womanizing and misappropriation of party funds was partly offset by his efforts to organize the British working classes. In London's East End, Engels' favor towards Aveling gradually alienated him from the British labor movement, which coalesced behind Keir Hardie's reformist Independent Labour Party, the forerunner of the modern British Labour Party, by the late 1880s. As he entered the twilight of his life, Engels was becoming more open to the efforts of the Social Democratic Party in Germany, which was making significant progress in the elections to the German Reichstag. Still, he remained committed to communist politics, and in 1889 played a key role in the establishment of the Second International. He engaged in a speaking tour of Europe in the early 1890s, speaking in front of enthusiastic crowds as he journeyed from Zurich to Vienna and thence to Berlin, the capital of the autocratic German Empire, but also a stronghold for the Social Democratic Party. While Engels appeared in fine health during his continental European tour, the work of editing Marx's papers and defending Marxism in socialist Congress halls had taken its toll on his health. His eyesight had been deteriorating for several years, and by the beginning of 1895, he was suffering from esophageal cancer. His condition rapidly deteriorated at the end of July, and he died late in the evening of August 5, 1895, a few months shy of his 75th birthday. Without any children of his own, he left more than half his estate to Marx's daughters, Lavra and Eleanor, while appointing the latter as her father's literary executor. In accordance with his will, his remains were cremated and cast out to sea off the south coast of England. Unlike Marx's famous tomb at Highgate, Engels would have no grave or funerary monument. Friedrich, later known as Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, came into this world on October 15, 1844, in the small village of Racken, near the town of Lutzen, within the territories of the Kingdom of Prussia. He received his name in honor of King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia, as fate would have it that his birth occurred on the monarch's birthday. Friedrich's father was Ludwig Nietzsche, a 31-year-old Lutheran minister serving the local parish church. After completing his theological studies at the University of Halle, Ludwig had devoted 7 years to working as a private tutor for the 3 daughters of Duke Joseph of Saxe-Altenburg, a minor prince who had distinguished himself during the Napoleonic campaigns. In 1842, shortly after assuming his pastoral duties at Racken, Ludwig encountered 17-year-old Franziska Oehler, Their courtship led to marriage the following October, coinciding with Ludwig's 30th birthday. Franziska came from ecclesiastical lineage, being the daughter of the priest serving the neighboring parish of Pobels. She was merely 19 years old when she brought Friedrich into the world. The couple would welcome 2 additional children into their household, a daughter named Elizabeth in 1846, and a son they called Ludwig Joseph 2 years thereafter. Earliest memories were profoundly shaped by his father's presence, who commanded considerable respect within their community. Living in a house filled with scholarly pursuits, young Friedrich found delight in handling the books that adorned his father's private study. This peaceful existence would soon be shattered by the revolutionary upheavals of 1848, which swept across the European continent during spring and summer. The conservative Nietzsche family watched with horror as the King of Prussia was compelled to yield to numerous demands from Prussian revolutionaries. Yet more personal tragedies would soon befall the household. Several months later, Friedrich's father began experiencing a series of unexplained seizures that confounded medical practitioners, leading to his death in July 1849. A few months thereafter, in January 1850, Friedrich's younger brother Ludwig Joseph also perished, just weeks before reaching his 2nd birthday. Following the deaths of his father and youngest sibling, Friedrich relocated with his family to the town of Naumburg, where his paternal grandmother Erdmuth and 2 aunts maintained their residence. The young 5-year-old Friedrich, affectionately called Fritz, initially found it difficult to adapt to the more metropolitan lifestyle in Naumburg. In 1851, he commenced his education under a priest in training named Weber, and quickly formed close friendships with 2 schoolmates, Wilhelm Pinder, whose family occupied one of the town's most distinguished residences, and the latter's cousin, Gustav Krug, son of a prominent local official and accomplished musician. In October 1854, 10-year-old Fritz and his companions gained admission to the Cathedral High School. 2 years subsequently, the Nietzsches relocated to more spacious accommodations. With access to a new piano, Fritz received instruction from a local choirmaster and demonstrated considerable musical aptitude. In October 1857, shortly after his 13th birthday, Friedrich began suffering from severe headaches. His mother removed him from school until his health improved. By the time he returned to his studies in early 1858, he had authored 2 brief dramatic works. His literary productivity continued later that year, during a visit to his maternal relatives at Pobels, where he composed a short autobiographical account of his youth, including fond reminiscences of his father's residence at Racken. Reflecting on the music he heard in his father's church, a 13-year-old Nietzsche championed the classical tradition of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, which leads our thoughts to higher things, while characterizing the music of contemporary romantic composers, such as Liszt and Berlioz, as decadent and of questionable cultural value, as it was being employed solely for enjoyment or to make a public exhibition of itself, although he would dedicate his adult life to challenging such moral assumptions. The teenage Nietzsche was already displaying the literary talent that would establish him as a profound writer, critic, and thinker. In September 1858, shortly after Nietzsche's return to Naumburg, he was awarded a scholarship to attend the prestigious Forda boarding school west of Naumburg. The academic program here followed typical 19th century patterns and emphasized the study of classical languages, including Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. While the school schedule required 10 hours of daily study, Nietzsche adjusted rapidly and found comfort in the proximity to Naumburg, which permitted regular family visits. However, he regretted separation from his friends Wilhelm and Gustav, both of whom continued their education in the town. After a memorable excursion to the university town of Jena during his summer vacation in July 1859, Nietzsche returned to Hund, Forda in August, and achieved top honors in his examinations. Nevertheless, the year was overshadowed by the death of his 72-year-old grandfather, David Oehler. which compelled his maternal relatives to depart from Koblenz. During the summer of 1860, Nietzsche, Wilhelm Pinder, and Gustav Krug established a three-member literary society called Germania, agreeing to convene regularly to discuss their respective musical and literary creations. As part of this endeavor, Nietzsche began composing a Christmas oratorio. In November, he received an extensive letter from Krug praising Richard Wagner's opera Tristan und Isolde, a passionate 5-hour spectacle based on Arthurian legend, which had not yet received its premiere, but whose musical scores were already available and being examined by critics. For the present, Nietzsche did not share his friend's enthusiasm for Wagner's compositions, though this would eventually change. He continued working on his oratorio, but was again afflicted by his migraines. Throughout 1861, he also began gravitating towards the music of Liszt, which he had previously condemned as sinful, and started developing interest in Slavic and Hungarian folklore. The year also had a transformative effect on Nietzsche's thinking about history and literature. For school, he wrote a provocative essay defending Friedrich Hölderlin, a poet and philosopher who contrasted German barbarism with the achievements of classical antiquity and who had endorsed the French Revolution. Elsewhere, Nietzsche drew inspiration from the English poet Lord Byron, particularly his superhuman romantic hero Manfred. Far more controversial was an essay he composed around this time that expressed support for Napoleon III, Emperor of the French and nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose armies had inflicted such devastation on Germany half a century earlier. Nietzsche's text drew criticism from both his friends, an early indication of Friedrich's willingness to court controversy through his writing. In the period that followed, Nietzsche's creativity flourished as his thinking continued to evolve. In an essay entitled Fate and History, Nietzsche came to understand that an individual who is theoretically free is, in reality, obeying numerous customs and traditions instilled from childhood, which he termed fate. For Nietzsche, an individual who was truly free had to continuously struggle against the constraints of fate. This realization led him to reject his Christian upbringing, marking the beginning of Nietzsche's lifelong quest to break free from the chains of Christian morality. Despite frequent episodes of poor health and headaches, Nietzsche continued to achieve academic success at Forda. By autumn 1862, he was finally prepared to embrace Wagner after the Germania Society acquired a copy of the score of Tristan und Isolde. Seated at his piano, Nietzsche enthusiastically joined Krug in working through the opera. Nietzsche was so impressed that he borrowed the score to take with him to Forda, ignoring Krug's complaints that purchasing it had been his idea. In his efforts to tear down the rules surrounding him, Nietzsche had begun joining his classmates in smoking and drinking. But in spring 1863, a teacher encountered him as he and a friend were returning to school from a drunken excursion, resulting in his demotion by 1 semester. His pursuit of literary interests caused his grades to decline, and he barely managed to pass his final examinations in late summer 1864. While his friends, Wilhelm Pinder and Gustav Krug, proceeded to university at Heidelberg, Nietzsche chose to study theology at Bonn. Despite his growing religious skepticism, Nietzsche arrived at Bonn in October, accompanied by his Forda classmate Paul Deussen, who would later become a distinguished Sanskrit scholar. Here he attended lectures by the prominent philologists Otto Jahn and Friedrich Nietzsche. Philology is considered a relatively obscure field of study today, yet in the 19th century, it represented the cutting edge of European scholarship. As a discipline, it combines literary criticism with analysis of texts and languages, all within a historical framework. It's important to bear this in mind, as most contemporaries considered Nietzsche primarily to be a philologist rather than a philosopher, as he is more commonly regarded today. Moreover, much of his earlier work falls clearly within the realm of philology. When he returned to Naumburg for the Easter holidays in 1865, Nietzsche shocked his mother by informing her that he was no longer planning to become a priest. His growing interest in philology had educated him about how myths develop, and he increasingly recognized that the early Christians had transformed the historical Jesus of Nazareth into a divine figure in a similar manner, supporting his arguments with a copy of David Strauss's Life of Jesus, published in 1835, and which attributed the Gospels in the Bible to early Christians. Several decades after Jesus' death, Nietzsche stubbornly resisted his family's efforts to convince him to return to theology. When he returned to Bonn, he formally transferred to the Faculty of Philology. Nietzsche soon decided that Bonn was not suitable for him, and chose to transfer to the University of Leipzig in his native Saxony. Aside from financial considerations, Nietzsche had decided to follow Friedrich Nietzsche, who had recently been recruited by Leipzig. Soon after his arrival at Leipzig in October 1865, the 21-year-old Nietzsche discovered the work of philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who would become the greatest influence on his thinking. In his book, The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer built on the work of his great predecessor Immanuel Kant by arguing that the empirical world is only a representation constructed from sensual perceptions, while the true world is defined by an unknowable will that exists among all living beings. In his efforts to understand this enigmatic force, Schopenhauer anticipated Darwin by recognizing that nature is a struggle for survival. Although humans had achieved a dominant position in nature through superior intellect, Schopenhauer pessimistically saw the human will as one that relentlessly pursues its desires, only to encounter boredom after attaining them. The only way to escape the suffering of the human condition was to appreciate the wonders of nature and art. In early 1866, Nietzsche furthered his intellectual pursuits by founding a philological club and presenting a paper that caught the attention of Professor Ritschl, who offered to support him in getting his work published. At this time, Saxony found itself caught up in a war between Prussia, the dominant power in northern Germany, and the Austrian Habsburg Empire, the largest German region in the south of Central Europe. After the Prussians won a decisive victory at Königgrätz in July, Prussia extended its influence, and Saxony effectively became a Prussian protectorate. Notwithstanding his academic success, in September 1867, Nietzsche was swept up in German patriotic fervor and enlisted in an artillery regiment. In March 1868, he was badly injured after falling from his horse. He took advantage of his recovery to work on his academic contributions. Shortly before entering military service, he had written a prize-winning essay on the 3rd century AD Greek historian and biographer of ancient philosophers, Diogenes Laertius. Laertius is our foremost source for details of the lives of many of the ancient world's most important philosophers. Men such as Zeno of Citium, the founder of the school of philosophy known as Stoicism. Nietzsche's essay on Laertius was subsequently published in a prestigious journal edited by Ritschl, who would accept 2 more of Nietzsche's contributions in 1868, at just 24 years of age. Nietzsche was firmly on the path to academic distinction when he returned to Leipzig in October 1868 after his military service. Following an introduction from a friend, on November 8th, Nietzsche was invited to a private gathering to meet one of his idols, Richard Wagner. After Wagner entertained his small audience by playing extracts from his operas, he and Nietzsche discussed philosophy, and the latter was delighted to hear that his favorite composer was also an enthusiastic admirer of Schopenhauer. At the end of the meeting, Wagner invited Nietzsche to visit him at his home in Lucerne, Switzerland, to continue their discussions. As fortune would have it, not long afterwards, Nietzsche received an astonishing offer to take up a professorship in classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland. Motivated by the salary of 3,000 Swiss francs annually, Nietzsche departed for the Alpine country in March 1869 to assume a professorship without even having completed his university degree. Clearly, His early published work had convinced his new departmental colleagues in Basel that the young man was worth hiring, degree or no degree. While he struggled with being away from friends and family in Germany, Nietzsche did make frequent trips to Wagner's villa at Tribschen on the shores of Lake Lucerne after arriving in Switzerland. There he cultivated good relations with Wagner's mistress and future wife, Cosima von Bülow, the daughter of Franz Liszt, whom he would later praise as the model for womanhood. Nietzsche was glad to become part of his idol's intimate circle at a time when Wagner was working on Siegfried, the third part of his epic ring cycle based on Germanic mythology, while the composer appreciated the young philologist's interest in his work. After spending Christmas with the Wagners, Nietzsche delivered two controversial lectures in early 1870, in which he argued that the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates, a revered figure in the canon of Western philosophy, was partly responsible for the degeneration of Greek culture from the heights of epic poetry and tragedy. He would soon expand on these ideas, arguing that classical Greek culture was actually at its height in the 6th and early 5th centuries BC, and that figures like Socrates in the late 5th century BC, with what Nietzsche viewed as a rather simplistic philosophical approach, represented a decline dot in April 1870. Nietzsche had his post at Basel confirmed as a permanent one, but his joy was short-lived after learning that he would be teaching 20 hours a week, a schedule that would leave little time for his own research and writing. He received a further shock a few weeks later when Wagner informed his close friends that he was intending to move away from Tribschen to manage his own opera theater at Bayreuth in Bavaria under the patronage of his admirer, King Ludwig II, where he hoped to stage his ring cycle with musicians trained under his direction. Early, disconsolate Nietzsche wrote to Cosima, suggesting that he might leave his academic post after a year or two and follow Wagner to Bayreuth. Meanwhile, Nietzsche's life was further disrupted when Napoleon III of France declared war on Prussia in July 1870. After spending his summer holiday with the Wagners, he obtained leave from the university to serve as a medical orderly in Eastern France and arrived at the headquarters of the Prussian Southern Army at Nancy in Lorraine, just before the Prussians defeated the French decisively at Sedan on September 2, 1870. Although the Franco-Prussian War was a short one and soon ended in January 1871 with the unification of the German Empire under Prussian domination, a move orchestrated by Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Nietzsche's views on it evolved in the few short months of the conflict. This was in part owing to his contracting both diphtheria and dysentery during his time as a medical orderly, conditions which further damaged his always precarious health. As a result, he took a dimmer view of Prussian aggression by the time the war came to an end. During the winter of 1870, while recovering from his ailments, he began to make plans to move away from his focus on philology in favor of studying philosophy more directly. After a joyful Christmas holiday during which he had the privilege of witnessing Wagner perform his Siegfried Idyll as a surprise birthday gift for Cosima, Nietzsche sank into depression when several friends refused to join him in Basel. Further disappointment followed when Nietzsche's request to take over the chair of philosophy at the university was denied. While recovering his health in Lugano, in Italian Switzerland, Nietzsche worked on a study of Greek tragedy, which eventually became a book under the title The Birth of Tragedy. Published in December 1871, Nietzsche identified within Greek tragedy a struggle between Apollonian and Dionysian forces, the former representing order and reason, and the latter chaos and emotion. These forces were manifested in the cults of Apollo, the Greek god of music and dance, and Dionysius, the Greek god of wine, excess, ecstasy, and madness. Nietzsche saw music as the highest representation of the Dionysian concept and speculated that the epic poetry of ancient Greece had been inspired by music. The book was dedicated to Wagner, whom Nietzsche argued had emulated the Greek tragedians in achieving a perfect balance of Apollonian and Dionysian elements. The composer was delighted with Nietzsche's work and asked the author to send copies to his patron King Ludwig of Bavaria and his father-in-law Franz Liszt. Although the book proved popular among artists and musicians, the academic community was less enamored by Nietzsche's conjectural approach to philology, and Nietzsche was disappointed to find his mentor Friedrich Nietzsche among the critics. That said, any reader of The Birth of Tragedy today will find a refreshingly novel insight into classical Greek culture. Nietzsche was already very much carving out his own path by the early 1870s. When it came to his interpretations, Nietzsche saw himself along with Wagner as the vanguard of a movement striving to return German culture to the heights it had attained. At the turn of the 19th century, the era of Kant, Mozart, Goethe, and Beethoven. In early 1872, he delivered a series of public lectures attacking the German education system and warning against the trend towards democratization of education. While he recognized a need for practical training of state officials, farmers, and factory workers, he argued that cultural education and intellectualism were being denigrated by making it overly functional, with the goal that individuals should solely be training for a profession at all times, rather than engaging in scholarship as an end in and of itself. In May, he went to Bayreuth to attend a ceremony marking the laying down of the foundation stone of Wagner's new theater at Bayreuth, an edifice built to the composer's specifications. Back in Basel, Nietzsche soon found himself in the middle of a vicious debate in the pages of national newspapers about the merits of his book, The Birth of Tragedy. While he appreciated the publicity, he realized that most of his fellow philologists were against him, and after spending his summer holidays in Italy, Nietzsche returned to Basel to find that only 2 students had signed up for his course on Greek and Roman rhetoric. He was forced to abandon a second lecture course on Homer altogether. Unperturbed, Nietzsche now decided to work on a study of pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, which he hoped to publish under the title Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks. In time for Wagner's 60th birthday in May 1873, when he visited the Wagners in early April in Bayreuth to inspect construction work on the theater, Nietzsche's reading from his latest work received a somewhat cool reception, and his efforts to lighten the mood by playing one of his compositions on the piano were likewise received awkwardly. By early May, Nietzsche had almost finished his new book when he became distracted by the publication of The Old and New Faith by David Strauss, the writer whose Life of Jesus had inspired Nietzsche to give up religion. Now, 4 decades after the Life of Jesus first appeared, Strauss' latest work set out a vision of progressive Christianity that labeled Schopenhauer's pessimistic diagnosis of the human condition as the product of a putrefying brain. Nietzsche was infuriated by this and wrote a polemical essay targeting Strauss as the representative of contemporary cultural Philistinism in Germany that had stopped seeking truth and beauty and instead looked for easy and comfortable answers. This polemic of Nietzsche's against Strauss was the first of a series of 4 essays, which would eventually be published together in 1876 under the title Untimely Meditations, and the next installment under the heading On the Use and Abuse of History for Life. Nietzsche argued that it was worth studying the past as a reminder that it was possible for humanity to achieve greatness, but warned against hero worship and myth-making, suggesting that periodically the past should be re-examined with an eye to the future. Nietzsche then proceeded to attack the scientific approach to history in Germany, which served to undermine the power of the past. In another essay from this time, entitled Schopenhauer as Educator, he praised the manner in which Schopenhauer sought to liberate his readers from convention. It certainly influenced Nietzsche. He was nothing if not original in his views. The 4th of his untimely meditations, Nietzsche turned his attention to art with a piece entitled Richard Wagner in Bayreuth. Although he had written most of it by early 1875, he was once again struck down by ill health that would leave him almost blind. Scholars had debated what afflicted Nietzsche for well over a century. Many have concluded that he was suffering from tertiary syphilis, but it may have been a number of different ailments that gradually became worse over time, notably gastric spasms, hemorrhoids, debilitating headaches, failing eyesight, and eventually fits and fainting spells. Some have speculated that these myriad neurological issues indicate the development of a brain tumor. It was not until July 1876 that Nietzsche recovered enough from this latest bout of ill health that he managed to complete the manuscript of film Richard Wagner in Bayreuth with the assistance of a young musician and admirer named Heinrich Tasselitz. Copies were immediately sent out to Wagner, who urged Nietzsche to hurry to Bayreuth to attend the final rehearsals in advance of the premiere of The Ring. Cycle in mid-August. Nietzsche arrived there by July 22nd, but found the town full of aristocrats who were there for the social occasion rather than any particular appreciation of Wagner's work. Keen to get away from the crowds, Nietzsche refused an invitation to meet the King of Bavaria. The University of Basel now granted Nietzsche a year-long sabbatical. He spent the first part of it in Italy with Malwida von Meysenbug, a German aristocrat, who had turned her back on her family and befriended several prominent European revolutionaries, and was an enthusiastic admirer of both Wagner and Nietzsche's work. Although Meysenbug was 28 years Nietzsche's senior, she became one of his closest confidants after their first meeting in Munich several years earlier. Nietzsche traveled to Sorrento in the Bay of Naples with two companions, Albert Brenner and Dr. Paul Rie, both of whom had previously been his students. Under Rie's influence, Nietzsche found himself questioning Schopenhauer's more pessimistic writings. He also became embroiled in a disagreement with Wagner at this time, whose German nationalism Nietzsche was increasingly critical of. Aside from any philosophical disagreements, Wagner knew that his ambitions for Nietzsche to edit a journal to promote his ideas about music and art were unlikely to be realized given Nietzsche's poor health. Following his return to Basel in autumn 1877, Nietzsche went to Dr. Otto Eisser in Frankfurt for a medical examination. The doctor diagnosed a damaged optic nerve as the source of his failing eyesight and prescribed his patient an absolute avoidance of reading and writing for years to come. This was an instruction Nietzsche was never going to even remotely consider. During his sabbatical, Nietzsche had been working on a fifth, untimely meditation about the human condition, but by the time the manuscript was completed, it had become a separate book of more than 300 pages under the title Human, All Too Human. This was published in the spring of 1878. Composed of a series of 638 aphorisms intended to communicate his thoughts concisely, if not systematically. Nietzsche argued that there were no eternal truths, and that the efforts of Kant and Schopenhauer to discover such truths were fundamentally misguided. In a dramatic reversal of his earlier views, Nietzsche now placed science on a higher level than art, arguing that small scientific discoveries had done much to advance human progress. While Nietzsche continued to acknowledge the importance of art, he described it as a bridge to facilitate the transition from religion and superstition to his free-spirited way of thinking. Indeed, the subtitle of the book was A Book for Free Spirits. Elsewhere in the book, he continued his relentless attack on Christianity by asserting that its core precepts had no rational and scientific basis, that its notions of good and evil were social constructs which had no place in the modern world. Nietzsche knew that his new book would infuriate Wagner and chose not to send him a copy. Later, he heard from his and Wagner's publisher, Ernst Schmeitzner, that the composer had acquired a copy of the book but did not read much of it before setting it aside in order to not disturb the positive impression he had of Nietzsche's early work. Many of Nietzsche's friends were equally critical after reading the book, and were especially troubled by his rejection of morality. In response to his critics, Nietzsche doubled down by writing a second part subtitled Mixed Opinions and Maxims. offering another 400-odd aphorisms in which he argued that Christian humility and self-denial were, in fact, a manifestation of a self-centered desire to avoid eternal damnation, and that Christianity was a cult of suffering. Nietzsche's deteriorating health prompted him to request to be relieved of his duties at the University of Basel in May 1879. By now in his mid-30s, his thinking had evolved considerably during his years at Basel, though over the course of the next decade he would have to eke out an existence as an independent philosopher with a pension of 3,000 Swiss francs a year from the university and occasional financial support from friends and family. However, despite his poor health and the manner in which his work in the 1870s had strongly divided opinion, Nietzsche was about to embark on the most productive period of his life, as the liberation from his academic duties freed him to research and write to an unprecedented extent. By autumn 1879, he had already put together another collection of free-thinking aphorisms entitled The Wanderer and His Shadow. In this, Nietzsche denounced the promotion of abstract concepts, such as the salvation of the soul, arguing that human beings should not be troubled by metaphysical considerations. Addressing an age-old question about the state of nature, he attacked Jean-Jacques Rousseau's notion that man is born free, but everywhere is in chains, arguing that rather than voluntarily giving up part of their freedoms for the social good, human communities evolved in response to external threats, and the earliest forms of justice were no more than legalized systems of revenge. By giving his book the title, The Wanderer and His Shadow, Nietzsche used his aphorisms to explore positive and negative aspects of the same issue. For instance, addressing the impacts of war, Nietzsche asserted that while war was clearly a destructive force, it can also provide the necessary catalyst to rejuvenate stagnant communities and resolve long-standing tensions within them. These views were often controversial, but many of the ideas outlined in The Wanderer and His Shadow are now widely incorporated into the field of anthropology and the study of early human societies. The winter of 1879 proved disastrous for Nietzsche's health, and he spent 1880 on the move seeking more amenable climates. In February 1880, he went to the northern Italian lakes, where he met up with Heinrich Kasselitz and accompanied him to Venice. Nietzsche enjoyed Venice in the company of his young friend, whose support in transcribing Nietzsche's barely legible drafts into a fine copy proved indispensable. But the summer heat compelled him to move to the fashionable spa town of Mariengod, now in the Czech Republic. After returning to Naumburg in September, he returned to Italy in October to preempt the onset of winter and settled down in Genoa. Here, Nietzsche was prodigiously busy, and by February 1881, he had completed his draft of Morgenrate, or Morning Glow, which was published in June. While Nietzsche had high hopes for the book, it would prove to be one of his lesser-known works, though it allowed him to further develop his ideas about Christianity's harmful impact on human development while expressing his appreciation for Eastern religions, in particular Buddhism, which had largely cast aside the need for gods in favor of a quest for the spiritual fulfillment of the individual. January 1882 saw Nietzsche in unusually good health, and he was glad to have the company of Paul Rie, who had brought a typewriter with him to help Nietzsche with his work. Typewriters had only really become commercially available from the late 1860s onwards, and Nietzsche, who was trying to use one in a sustained manner for the first time, initially struggled to operate the machine, straining his eyes to make sure that he was pressing the right key. Now in his late 30s, Nietzsche made the light-hearted suggestion that he might need a wife, a subject that he had occasionally discussed before with Paul Rie and Maouida von Meysenbug during their time in Sorrento. After spending 5 weeks in Genoa with Nietzsche, Rie had continued his journey to Rome to stay with Meysenbug, in whose salon he encountered Lou Salome, a 21-year-old Russian-born poet whose iconoclastic opinions reflected her disillusionment at the religious and moral instruction she received as a student of theology. Rie insisted that Nietzsche ought to meet this extraordinary prodigy, and after a brief stay in Messina in Sicily, Nietzsche arrived in Rome in mid-April. In spite of their rather awkward initial encounters in Rome, Nietzsche was soon impressed by Salome's intellect. In Salome, Nietzsche believed that he had found a young female disciple who could support his work, although Salome later claimed that Nietzsche had proposed to her during a third meeting in Lucerne in early May. Nietzsche insisted that he was only after intellectual companionship, in contrast to Rie, who addressed incessant letters to her in distinctly romantic terms. In a plan devised by Salome, the three intended to live together in a philosophical commune in Vienna. To his skeptical friends, Nietzsche declared his intention to train Salome as his intellectual successor, and preemptively denied that he had any romantic interest in her. Nietzsche had arranged for his sister Elizabeth and Salome to meet in Bayreuth in July for a performance of Wagner's opera Parsifal, based on the Arthurian knight Percival's quest for the Holy Grail, one which Nietzsche hated due to its Christian inspiration. Despite their outward display of friendship, Elizabeth Nietzsche was irritated by the young Russian dot in the meantime. Nietzsche had added to his body of work with Joyous Science, in which he endorsed Charles Darwin's views on biological evolution, which were still enormously controversial over 20 years after The Origin of Species had first been published. At the same time, Nietzsche challenged the Darwinian concept of the survival of the fittest. Following this logic, the purpose of humans and all other animals was solely to survive. But Nietzsche observed that many individuals who had made the greatest contributions to human culture, such as the Renaissance artist Raphael or the composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, had died young without leaving any heirs. Nietzsche argued that human existence was both comic and tragic. The comic aspect was due to the vanity of short-lived humans who believed that they could master nature, while the tragic element came from the recognition that humans are an infinitesimally small part of the cosmos. Near the end of the book, Nietzsche issued a call to his readers to wage an intellectual war on behalf of science against religion. Joyous Science is peculiar in many ways, one which tried to apply the evolutionary biology of Darwin to a new theory of cultural evolution. Although Nietzsche had called his book Joyous Science, he concluded that the tragic aspects of human existence would always prevail. Nevertheless, his encounters with Lou Salome had inspired within him a sense of optimism about life. In August 1882, the two spent 3 weeks in philosophical discussions in the Teutoburg forest in Saxony, which Nietzsche hailed as one of the happiest times of his life. Arguments did occur, though, with his sister and mother about the propriety of his relationship with Salome, which led Nietzsche to leave Naumburg for Leipzig. There, the already precarious foundations of his triangular relationship began to crumble, as a jealous Rie resented Nietzsche's insistence on spending time alone with Salome, while the young and strong-minded Russian had no intention of submitting herself to Nietzsche's intellectual control. Nietzsche also admitted privately in his notebooks around this time that his desire for Salome had assumed a physical dimension. He was consequently immensely upset when the relationship between them all began to collapse in the weeks that followed. Plunged into a deep depression and resorting to taking growing quantities of opium to treat both his physical ailments and his emotional pain, Nietzsche continued an acrimonious correspondence in the months that followed with his erstwhile companions. From his retreat at Rapallo in Italy, all to no avail as they drifted apart. As emotionally turbulent a period as this was for Nietzsche, it proved an intellectually productive one, as he began working on what is often deemed to be his most important work, Thus Spake Zarathustra. In this, he sought to establish a new philosophical framework of his own, independent of the influence of Schopenhauer, Kant, or any other philosopher. This singularly Nietzschean philosophy was expressed via the mouthpiece of the ancient Persian prophet Zoroaster, who gave his name to Zoroastrianism, the world's first monotheistic faith, which had flourished in Mesopotamia and Persia in the Elder first millennium BC, and in which the creator god Ahura Mazda was involved in an eternal struggle with the demon Ahriman. Although Nietzsche rejected the dichotomy of good and evil introduced by Zoroastrianism, one that had clearly influenced the development of Christianity, he saw Zoroaster as a prophet who had challenged the status quo, hence his motives for expressing some of his own philosophical ideas through the mouthpiece of the Persian prophet. Nietzsche wrote the first part of Zarathustra within the space of 10 days in late January 1883. A couple of weeks later, he learned that Richard Wagner had died unexpectedly in Venice. They had not seen each other in over 6 years after, and no acrimonious divergence of views in the mid-1870s, though Nietzsche continued to revere elements of the great composer's work. During a visit to Rome in April 1883, Nietzsche reconciled with his sister Elizabeth, whom he had earlier blamed for the wrecking of his plans with Salome. By June, he was back at his favorite Swiss mountain retreat of Sils Maria, where he expressed his anger at his Leipzig publisher Ernst Schmeitzner for delaying the publication of the first part of Zarathustra. Nietzsche speculated at Zoroaster's declaration in the book that God is dead. Surely one of the most famous lines of modern philosophy had led Schmeitzner's printer to sit on the manuscript and delay its publication. The text was paradoxical. On the one hand, Nietzsche argued that the advent of science and modernity was leading to a growing secularism, one that would eventually lead to the death of Christianity. Yet, on the other hand, Zarathustra is evidently framed in the text as a parallel to Jesus Christ, and Nietzsche even referred to his book as a fifth gospel. These contradictions can be explained when we see that Nietzsche was arguing that man was now moving to a new stage of evolution after the religiosity of the past, one in which a new Bermensch, overman or superman, based on rationality and a higher culture, would emerge. By July, Nietzsche had completed the second part of Zarathustra, consisting of 22 further discourses in which he went further than ever in denouncing the hypocrisy of Christians seeking self-negating virtuousness for the sake of a heavenly kingdom. Nietzsche began to develop the idea of the will to power, substituting Schopenhauer's image of nature as a struggle for survival with a struggle for mastery, arguing that no relationship between two humans is without a desire to gain control over the other. As he elaborated on the concept, Nietzsche argued that Christianity had only been able to succeed because the emperors at the heart of the Roman Empire had realized in the 4th century that adopting the new religion served their material purposes well, and that the church soon became estranged from the moral message of Christ as the bishops of Rome sought ever greater power in medieval times. What was needed was a new morality entirely. In the third part of Zarathustra, completed in early 1884 during a stay in Nice, Nietzsche portrays Zoroaster returning to the mountains, where he draws the depressing conclusion that since time is infinite, everything in life is an eternal recurrence of what has already happened before and will happen again, and that humanity as a collective would never fully evolve. Though in the end, Nietzsche's Zoroaster or Zarathustra still finds comfort in the notion of eternity. Although Nietzsche intended this to be the final part of a Zarathustra trilogy, in January 1885, he wrote another 20 Zarathustra scenes of such an explicitly sacrilegious nature that he decided to limit the print run of this fourth part to 40 copies that he distributed among a select circle of friends. These exclusive copies were printed by the Leipzig printer Konstantin Naumann, who had also printed the first 3 volumes at Schmeitzner's request. By this point, Nietzsche had broken off with Schmeitzner. Meanwhile, Nietzsche received news that his sister Elizabeth was planning to marry Dr. Bernhard Forster, a Wagnerphile teacher who was planning to found a German nationalist community in South America after his radical opinions cost him his teaching jobs. While both Nietzsche and his mother were opposed to the match, the couple married in May and would leave for Paraguay in early 1886. After completing Zarathustra, Nietzsche decided to return to writing more conventional philosophical treatises, without using ancient religious philosophers as his mouthpiece. By March 1886, he had completed Beyond Good and Evil, a work he would struggle to find a publisher for, and which he eventually had published at his own expense on the first print run. There were reasons for this. Zarathustra had not sold well, and hundreds of copies of it, along with Nietzsche's other works, were languishing in storage. Publishers were reluctant to take on his books, fearing losses. The stock of his earlier books was eventually bought by the music publisher, Ernst Wilhelm Fritzsche. Despite his poor sales figures, Nietzsche ordered 1,250 copies of Beyond Good and Evil, regarding it as a concise statement of his thinking. This latest book was another attack on the forces of democratization and egalitarianism, which Nietzsche saw as evolving harmfully out of Christianity. Nietzsche took a stand against these developments, claiming that a great many elements of human progress and cultural creativity had taken place in aristocratic societies. Building on his belief that morality was an artificial construct designed to control people within society, Nietzsche distinguished between what he termed a slave morality and a master morality. Given his optimism about the book's potential commercial appeal, Nietzsche was deeply disappointed to learn in February 1887 that only 65 copies of Beyond Good and Evil had been sold. Among the few readers who appreciated the book was Meta von Salis, a Swiss writer and historian who had just become the first woman in Switzerland to receive a doctorate. Nietzsche and Salis had known each other since 1884 and became close friends in the summer of 1887. Salis visited Nietzsche in Sils Maria, where, in an effort to encourage sales of Beyond Good and Evil, he began work on a follow-up volume entitled On the Genealogy of Morality. Drawing on his training in philology, Nietzsche observed that the word for good in many ancient languages derived from words denoting nobility and bravery, while bad related to words such as common or lowly. According to Nietzsche, the process of linguistic transformation began first with the ancient, priestly classes of the Levant and wider parts of the Middle East, where civilization had first flourished. For these people, purity and faith were more important than nobility or courage. Out of this tradition, there later emerged the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, who encouraged humanity to sympathize with the poor and lowly in exchange for spiritual comfort. For Nietzsche, it was the warrior class of Germanic and Scandinavian conquerors who prevented Europe from becoming a Christian theocracy. After the fall of the Roman Empire, although they adopted Christianity, the new kings established an aristocratic hierarchy that was inspired by Roman rule. However, the Protestant Reformation and the French Revolution saw a return of the slave morality in places like Calvinist Geneva in the 16th century. While many individuals will disagree with Nietzsche's arguments about morality in terms of the rigor of his analysis in tracing how Judeo-Christian morality developed over a period of 3 millennia, On the Genealogy of Morality is one of Nietzsche's most significant works. Throughout the creative process for these philosophical texts, Nietzsche continued to suffer from frequent bouts of ill health. Nevertheless, during a stay in Nice in the early months of 1888, he experienced his best health for several years and conceived of a 4-volume work entitled The Will to Power as the crowning statement of his philosophy. Yet, as early as March, he recognized that the plan was too ambitious and abandoned it. By that time, he was searching for a new refuge and decided to head to Turin. The city's climate and its music culture delighted Nietzsche, who remained for 3 months until leaving for Sils Maria. In a burst of creativity, Nietzsche wrote The Case of Wagner, a polemical critique in which he cast his erstwhile musical idol as a symbol of decadence and decay in European music and society. He continued with The Twilight of the Idols, a series of light-hearted attacks on all the philosophical and religious doctrines Nietzsche opposed. with a title parodying the final opera in Wagner's Ring Cycle, The Twilight of the Gods. This was followed by The Antichrist, an investigation into the origins of Christianity, in which Nietzsche argued that while Jesus, whose kingdom of God was both in the future and in the present, had encouraged his followers to live free from hatred and resentment, the early Christians imposed a doctrine of judgment that used the concepts of heaven and hell as a system of rewards and punishments. Nietzsche compared Jesus' original teachings to those of Buddhism, remarking that Buddhism makes no promises but keeps them. Christianity promises everything but keeps nothing. Nietzsche had returned to Turin in September to mark the occasion of his 44th birthday on October 15, 1888. He decided to write an autobiographical work under the title Ecce Homo, or Behold the Man, the words attributed to Jesus' executioner, Pontius Pilate, as he presented him to the Jewish crowd. In this short volume, Nietzsche hoped to clear up misunderstandings about his work to date, under provocative chapter titles such as Why Am I So Wise? And Why I Write Such Good Books. Nietzsche explored his upbringing, his poor health, and the thinkers and artists of the past who had inspired him, both positively and negatively. In his defense of his own work, Nietzsche suffused the text with exaggeration, claiming that his Zarathustra was superior to anything that Goethe, Shakespeare, or Dante had ever produced. Ecce Homo should not be read literally in all places. And clearly, whether in his boastful passages about his literary prowess or in the sarcastic titles of the chapters, Nietzsche was being humorous. Having written Ecce Homo in the space of 3 weeks, he returned to the split between himself and Wagner many years earlier, something which still clearly troubled him deeply. Compiling extracts from his previous work, he argued that it was not he who had changed his mind about German culture back in the mid-1870s, but Wagner, who became increasingly nationalist and pandered to the popular mood of the day. Nietzsche's burst of immense activity in the 1880s was soon to come to an end. At the end of the year, his mental state suddenly deteriorated. He became prone to fits of anger, and in his delusions of grandeur, he wrote letters addressed to Kaiser Wilhelm II and Bismarck, denouncing their doctrines. In correspondence to friends, he wrote about forming an anti-German league and bringing down the German Empire. In a letter to Meta von Salis, dated January 3, 1889, Nietzsche declared that God is on earth, and claimed to have imprisoned the Pope and ordered Kaiser Wilhelm and Bismarck to be shot. According to an account published after his death, Nietzsche's condition became public when he saw a horse being flogged by its driver in the streets of Turin and ran to protect it before collapsing at its feet. Clearly, he was deeply unwell. And both those who argue that he was syphilitic or suffering from a brain tumor agree that whatever his condition was, it became much worse in the course of 1888 and 1889. As news of his erratic behavior spread, Nietzsche's family hurried to have him brought back to Switzerland. After a series of medical examinations, which determined that Nietzsche may have been suffering from syphilis contracted as a young man, the philosopher was transferred to the care of his mother, Franziska, in Naumburg. For a year or two, Nietzsche could still string together a few coherent sentences in conversation, but over time, his condition worsened irreversibly. The fate of Nietzsche's final unpublished works was still up in the air until 1892, when Elizabeth gave Naumann the right to publish a second edition of her brother's complete works, edited by Heinrich Kasselitz, who used the pseudonym Peter Gast that Nietzsche bestowed upon him for his musical compositions. Elizabeth's ill-fated Paraguayan adventure had come to an end, and its failure had caused her husband to take his own life in despair. In 1893, she decided to take control of the whole process, sidelining Kasselitz and writing her own biography of her brother, in which she resumed her vengeful attacks against Lou Salome, blaming her in part for her brother's psychological collapse By 1895, after an argument with her mother about the publication of The Antichrist, Elizabeth bought out her mother's rights to future royalties. When Franziska died in April 1897, Elizabeth moved her brother to the Villa Silberblick near Weimar, where she received admirers of Nietzsche's works and took them to see him. Despite his condition, on August 25, 1900, a couple of months shy of his 56th birthday, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche died at Villa Silberblick following a heart attack. 3 days later, he was buried beside his father at the parish church in Racken, despite the protests of the vicar, following a tumultuous life in which he struggled against persistent illness to become firstly a distinguished academic and secondly an original thinker who sought to dismantle conventional morality. The iconoclastic anti-Christian philosopher found his final resting place in a Christian graveyard. In a further irony, just as Nietzsche argued that Jesus' followers distorted his teaching after his death, Nietzsche's own thinking was misrepresented by imperialists, communists, and fascists who adapted his concepts of will to power, master morality, and the Superman for their own ends. The worst culprit of all was Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, who promoted her brother as a German nationalist and anti-Semite, and was received by Adolf Hitler on several occasions before her death at the age of 88 in 1935. Both Wagner and Nietzsche had their work exploited by the Nazis towards their own political ends in the 1930s and early 1940s. There are very few philosophers in human history who have left behind as contentious a legacy as Friedrich Nietzsche did. On the one hand, he has been rightly praised as one of the most startlingly original thinkers of modern times. Whether one agrees or disagrees with the conclusions he drew, there is no doubt that the arguments he put forward in books like The Zio, Birth of Tragedy, Beyond Good and Evil, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and the essays in Untimely Meditations were extremely novel in their approach. However, many people have found his rejection of the ideas of social egalitarianism and his fundamental rejection of conventional Western morality unpalatable. That being said, the attribution of fascist views to him is not accurate. Moreover, even if one finds his arguments unpalatable, there is no denying their influence. His commentaries on the so-called death of God in an increasingly secular age foreshadowed the decline of the Christian churches in 20th century Europe and laid the groundwork for much of the existential philosophy of the post-war era. Many of Nietzsche's arguments about the evolution of society have also been absorbed to varying degrees into the fields of history, anthropology, and sociology, and that is perhaps the most striking thing about Nietzsche, the sheer breadth of Allah. His work, it went far beyond philosophical inquiry to embrace history, anthropology, philology, religion, literary and artistic criticism, musical theory, and much more besides. Thus, whether one loves or loathes him, there is no ignoring Nietzsche in modern scholarship. Friedrich Engels leaves behind a complicated legacy. He was one of the most important figures in the history of communism, though he was always overshadowed within the communist movement by his lifelong collaborator, Karl Marx. Yet Engels was an important figure in his own right. From an early age, he adopted an antagonistic attitude towards his family's capitalist wealth and took his own independent path, though he later reconciled with his father and was happy to live off the proceeds of an industrial company, even while criticizing the economic system which allowed it to thrive. His collaboration with Marx began in the mid-1840s and continued for half a century beyond Marx's own time, with Engels being responsible for editing and finishing the second and third volumes of Marx's Das Kapital in the 1880s and 1890s. The pair are widely known for co-authoring the Communist Manifesto. Though Marx primarily wrote it, it was a distillation of their collective views. However, Engels should not be viewed entirely in the shadow of Marx's work. He was a formidable writer and social critic in his own right. In particular, the condition of the working class in England written by Engels when he was still a young man in his early to mid-20s, is considered today as a classic account of the effects of industrialization on England in the middle of the 19th century. Regardless of how one perceives Engels' wider politics, there is no denying that given the crimes of the communist regimes of the 20th century, Engels and Marx are both controversial figures in many ways. But at the same time, Engels should not merely be viewed as an editor of Marx's work or a sidekick of some kind, but rather as a substantial political writer in his own right. What do you think of these great philosophers? Were they profound thinkers who shaped our understanding of society, morality, and human nature, or do their ideas bear responsibility for some of the darker chapters in modern history? As you drift into peaceful sleep tonight, let these questions float gently through your mind, and perhaps tomorrow you'll find new perspectives waiting for you. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and thank you for joining us on this philosophical journey through Sleepy Crown.